Jokes. All right, the committee will come to order without objection. The chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. This hearing is entitled Congress and the Frank, Bringing Congressional Mail Standards into the 21st Century. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes to give an opening statement. Happy Halloween, everybody. I am dressed as America's most maligned superhero, Congressman, able to fly across the country in 6 hours on Alaska Airlines. We were thinking about titling this hearing Frankenstein, how the House's ghoulish mailing standards have haunted members for decades. But I suppose we should go with the official unspooky title for the record. Like most of the issues that fall into this committee's mandate, franking and the work of the House Commission on Congressional Mailing Standards is very inside baseball. To most people, frank is a name or a hot dog, but the reality is for members of Congress, the congressional frank is actually fundamental to how we communicate with our constituents. And every time we respond to constituent requests or send newsletters or send notices about upcoming town halls, we use the frank. And it's no surprise that with the rise of social media, Congress has seen an overall decline in members' use of the frank. 10 years ago, members spent an average of $58,000 on franked mail, and today's members spend an average of about $26,000. Obviously, there's a lot of variation by district and by member, but still there's no getting around the fact that social media has had a tremendous impact on how Congress communicates with its constituents. 10 years ago, Congress didn't even have a digital media staff, and today almost every committee has one, including ours. And given these changes in the way that Congress and the American people communicate, today's hearing is actually really important. If history is any indicator, communications platforms will continue to rapidly evolve, and Congress needs to adapt so that members can communicate as effectively as possible with the people they represent. And I know that Representative Susan Davis and the Franking Commission have put a lot of thought into these issues and have some ideas about how to modernize the frank. Members also need to understand the differences across platforms so that they can make smart choices about how to best communicate. And the frank comes with geographic constraints that social media doesn't. And some social media platforms come with advertising that frank mail doesn't. So the bottom line is that communicating is a lot easier today, but it's also a lot more complicated. And I'm looking forward to what our witnesses have to say about all these issues, and it's important for us to understand the history of the frank as well as modern trends and how members communicate with their constituents. This community is focused on making Congress work better so that we can better serve the American people, and I think this hearing is wholly in support of that mission. So now I'd like to invite our Vice Chair, Tom Graves, to share some opening remarks and any Halloween jokes he has as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think you stole them all there. You know, all I have is the last name. That's all I can do on Halloween. Thanks for holding this hearing today. Look, as you said, Mr. Chairman, there are more ways than ever to talk with our constituents back home. And with the click of a mouse, we can connect throughout our district to help solve problems, share legislative updates, and hear ideas and opinions from those we represent. Communication with those we represent is one of the most important parts of our jobs as we are representatives for them. But the current franking process, as you described, one that most don't even know about or understand, feels light years behind the speed of communications and the opportunities that we have today. We all want to quickly and effectively communicate and get information back to our constituents. And as a result, throughout this year with this committee, we have heard from many of our colleagues who have many ideas for reforming Congress, including this process of communication. So on this topic, many of the freshman members have stepped up to voice their opinions and have questioned the way we do things. And I'm very grateful for that because they've experienced the rules and the regulations and the procedures for the first time. And thankfully, they're very quick to highlight ways to improve or suggestions they may have to allow us to communicate differently and better and quicker. So I look forward to hearing today. I think it's going to be great and be a wonderful Halloween day. What better way to start it off than right here in a great committee hearing on franking. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right. Today we welcome testimony of 5 witnesses. Our first panel, which we're calling the Davis panel. We have Representative Susan Davis, the chair of the House Commission on Congressional Mailing Standards, and Representative Rodney Davis, who in addition to serving on this committee, served as chair of the House Commission on Congressional Mailing Standards in the 115th Congress. Both are here to share their knowledge and ideas for reforming the franking process. Each will provide 5 minutes of testimony, and once they finish, we'll move on to the next panel. So Representative Susan Davis, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman Gilmer and Vice Chairman Graves. You do understand that we get confused now and then, so I appreciate your pointing that out. And of course, members of the Select Committee, it's a pleasure to join you on this historic day for what has to be the House's first ever Frankenstein hearing. I want to acknowledge and thank House Administration Chair Zoe Lofgren, House Administration Committee Ranking Member Rodney Davis, and the Franking Commission's new Ranking Member Brian Steele, all of whom play a key role in the future of mass communications. The House's current franking rules have certainly spooked members, staff, and constituents over the years. But the good news is that we can make the whole franking process both less scary and more effective. Contrary to what many staff believe, the House Franking Manual was not created to frighten people, but rather with the good intention of preventing members from misusing taxpayer funds for personal, political, or commercial use. However, after nearly 2 decades of working with those rules, we've seen that the rules have the unintended side effect of slowing things down and preventing members from writing the way they speak when they conduct official business. Our commission took a fresh look at the rules and came up with a new approach. It has 2 main components, which go hand in hand: greater transparency and a simpler set of rules. Greater public transparency ensures greater member accountability. We can achieve transparency easily by making the frank advisory opinions available online. The House's website can link to ours as it currently does for financial disclosure reports, foreign travel reports, gift and travel filings, legal expense fund disclosures, and statements of disbursements. And I would just state again, because you all know this, the whole idea is to have members' franking communications be available to their constituents and the public like other reports, which I've just noticed, which really does, I believe, discourage undue advantage of the franking privilege. Combined with transparency, a shorter set of clear and essential rules will prevent the misuse of taxpayer funds. I look forward to sharing the new list of rules we are developing with you and all of our colleagues soon, and staffs are pulling those together and actually have come up with quite a bit of consensus. As we work on our new package at franking, we have some requests of the Modernization Committee relating to digital communications. My written testimony goes into greater detail, but I'll highlight a few main asks now. First, we suggest the Modernization Committee recommend consolidating, and I'll quote, digital communications and putting it under our jurisdiction. Right now, we are only charged with reviewing postal mail, but in practice, we review all communications. And second, the Modernization Committee should evaluate the appropriateness, and again, I think this is for you all to look at, of allowing members the option to transfer their social media followers from campaign accounts to their official accounts from time to time, or perhaps just one time, and also consider allowing campaign websites to link to official sites. This would eliminate confusion we all hear from our constituents while maintaining appropriate separation. And third, we need to use technology to upgrade district office mail reports, which are still self-reported and done by hand. Perhaps we could fix this with a unique barcode. I'll wrap up now because I know votes and pumpkins are fast approaching. Thank you again. It has been a pleasure working with all of you and your staff as well. We look forward to your next set of recommendations.
Thank you, Chair Davis. And now, Representative Rodney Davis, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the Vice Chair and also to the Chair of the Franking Commission, my good friend, Ms. Davis. I will tell you, it's an honor to speak from this side of the dais, and I know I'll go back around to that side as soon as I'm done, but to be able to talk about something that a lot of folks in and around Washington don't want to take the time to delve into, but it's very important for the job we do in communicating with our constituents. Last Congress, I was the chair of the Franking Commission, and I have to commend my colleague, Ms. Davis, because we were able to work together to implement some new processes that have made the frank easier, but we're not done yet. And I do want to say, the folks that work on House administration and take in these franking requests, my staffers, Tim and Elizabeth, do a great job in making sure they work with our member offices to implement many of the arcane standards that we put in place. But Susan and I and our teams were able to actually make the process easier. We're required 100% online submissions, no more paper. I mean, we're in the 21st century. This is the thing we should do. We digitized everything, which makes the process for turning that approval or disapproval around faster. And it's something that I know was a goal of both of us when we were on the commission. We've got to do more. And there's finally, I believe, an appetite on both sides to roll up our sleeves, as Chair Davis said, get our teams together, come up with some solutions, and I believe we're doing that. I'm very happy that Leader McCarthy appointed our colleague, Congressman Brian Stile, a freshman, a former staffer like many of us, who's had to use the frank. And he's doing a great job of getting involved and finding out how we can even expand on what Susan and I did with our teams last year. We had recent bipartisan negotiations, and there's, as she said, there's opportunities for substantial changes to the franking rules. And we have three main buckets that we're focusing on making improvements on. The speed of approval. We want to get these approvals turned around faster. Transparency, and then also developing regulations that work for the 21st century. Let me outline a few of the reasons why these reforms are in such need. First, the existing regulations are burdensome and they're very bureaucratic. We're literally measuring the size of pictures and counting the number of times the letter I is used. Staff precedent has not been updated in regulations. Now let me get this straight. Many of the rules that we follow and approvals that our teams follow have been set by precedent between staff for decades. We, as members, ought to codify those precedents into rules and regulations so we don't have any changes when we have changes on the committee and leadership. That's something that I'm looking forward to working with this committee and also with Brian and with Susan on. It's hard to follow rules when they're not written down and when they're not transparent. I also think we should revisit when franking is needed. I mean, there are many times we ought to have just an automatic approval process. And also, what are the consequences if members and staff don't follow those rules? For example, does it make sense that a Facebook ad going to 500 people at a cost of $20 is subject to the same review as a physical mailer going to 100,000 people at a cost of 50,000 taxpayer dollars? Furthermore, the expectation of privacy is not the same as it was 10 years ago, and as a result, we support increased transparency standards for franking. I also believe that with greater transparency comes a check and balance with constituents and the American taxpayer that should replace the role of staff here in D.C., measuring pictures and counting eyes. Finally, as members of this committee contemplate recommendations, keep in mind three things. Members need to send communications to their constituents. Reasonable regulations are necessary to prevent abuse. And finally, that regulations and guidance need to be transparent, accessible, and easy to understand. Beyond those basic premises, I encourage the members to think bold, and also new ideas are always welcome. And I will take this opportunity to yield 29 seconds back to you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Thank you both. You both stuck the landing. And thank you both for your testimony. And Chairwoman Davis, I know it's a busy morning for you, so thank you for making time to come. We'll now invite up our next panel of witnesses to take their seats. Perhaps as they do, I will start providing introductions just in the interest of time. Our first witness is Dr. Matthew Glassman, a senior fellow at the Government Affairs Institute at Georgetown University. Prior to joining GAI, Dr. Glassman worked at the Congressional Research Service for 10 years. His portfolio includes congressional operations, franking, separation of powers, appropriations, judicial administration, agency design, and congressional history. He was detailed to the House Committee on Appropriations as professional staff for the Legislative Branch Subcommittee in fiscal year 2010 and 2011. Our next witness is Joshua Tucker, a professor of politics at New York University. Dr. Tucker is a co-principal investigator of the NYU Social Media and Political Participation Laboratory and a co-director of the NYU Center for Social and Political Behavior. Dr. Tucker specializes in comparative politics with an emphasis on elections and voting, public opinion formation, and the use of social media in facilitating all forms of political participation. He's also a co-editor of The Monkey Cage, an award-winning political science and politics blog, which appears in the Washington Post. Our final witness is Josh Billigmeyer. Did I get that right? Great. Who for the past 15 years has worked with congressional offices to streamline the CRM operations and leverage new technologies. Prior to focusing on developing software solutions for congressional offices full-time, Josh worked at several telecommunications and software testing startups. In 2018, he became CEO of Fireside, a congressionally focused software business that he co-founded. Witnesses are reminded that your oral testimony will be limited to 5 minutes, and without objection, your written statements will be made part of the record. Dr. Glassman, you're now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony.
Chairman Kilmer, Vice Chairman Graves, and members of the Select Committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I'm Matt Glassman, and I'm a Senior Fellow at the Government Affairs Institute at Georgetown University. I'm also an alum of the Congressional Research Service, where my portfolio consisted of institutional issues in Congress, including member communication and the Franken privilege. I'm a legislative branch patriot and committed to the goal of a modern, capable, and powerful legislature. In my written testimony, I provide a historical and contextual overview of the Franken privilege. Specifically, I discuss its origins and rationale, the longstanding criticisms of it, and the variety of frameworks Congress has used to regulate franking. Member-constituent communication is a building block of representative democracy. If information about legislative activity cannot easily flow from members to constituents, citizens will be less capable of drawing policy judgments about congressional action and electoral judgments about members. Likewise, if constituents cannot easily communicate preferences to members, congressional action is less likely to reflect public opinion. Indeed, for most of the 19th century, postage-free frank mail could not only be sent by members, but could also be sent to Congress by constituents. The legislative franking privilege dates to 17th century England and has existed continuously in the United States since the first Congress, except for a brief period in the 1870s when it was temporarily abolished. The modern system dates to comprehensive franking reform passed in 1973 and subsequent reforms made in the late 1980s. It includes many of the familiar restrictions: a ban on using private money to produce frank mail material, limits on overall franking expenditures, public disclosure of individual member costs, and pre-election bans on mass mailing. In the past 20 years, House regulation of email and other electronic communications have been built on top of the existing franking regulations. Two longstanding criticisms have been lodged against the Franken privilege. First, that it's financially wasteful, and second, that it gives unfair advantage to incumbents in congressional elections. In 2018, House members sent just under 78 million pieces of unsolicited mass mail at a total cost of $27.6 million and an average cost of 35 cents per piece. These expenditures are actually quite small by historical standards. Between 1988 and 2018, official congressional postage costs dropped by over 80%. The contemporary costs of mass mailing, however, are being driven by an increasingly small number of offices. In 2004, 85% of offices sent at least one mass postal mailing. In 2018, only 61% did. Furthermore, over half the cost of postal mass mailings were accrued by 65 high-spending offices that averaged $216,000 in mass mailing expenses. Several offices spent more than a quarter of their MRA on mass postal mail. As has been the case for decades, freshman members and members in electoral swing districts spend much more on mass mailing than senior members and members in electorally safe districts. And overall frank mail costs continue to be higher in election years than non-election years. Throughout history, technological developments have altered member-constituent communications and have often triggered regulatory changes. For example, the rise of computer-generated mailing lists and postal patron mail service in the 60s expanded the ability of members to reach constituents. It also led to an explosion in the amount of unsolicited mail sent. The rise of electronic communications in the 21st century is once again changing how members and constituents communicate. Email is now the most popular way for constituents to reach members. Social media accounts allow for real-time interaction that have virtually no marginal cost to either member or constituent. These changes call into question the relevance and financial efficiency of the traditional frank postal mail system, which has become a smaller portion of most members' constituent communications in recent years. While members sent over almost 78 million pieces of mass mail in 2018, they sent over 1.2 billion pieces of mass communication. These mass communications cost, on average, less than 1/2 of 1 cent per piece, making them 70 times less expensive than traditional postal mass mailings. As a public policy, the franking privilege has 5 dimensions: who's entitled to frank, what can be franked, how much can be sent, where it can be sent, and when it can be sent. In addition, policy choices exist regarding transparency and how franking costs will be accounted and paid for. Congress has used a variety of regulatory frameworks to answer these questions in the past. The contemporary system is a product of the late 20th century, quite different from regulatory structures that preceded it, and increasingly out of sync with the rapidly changing constituent communication environment of the 21st century. Thank you for having me here today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you for your testimony, and Dr. Tucker, you're now recognized for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Chairman Kilmer, Vice Chairman Graves, and members of the Select Committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. My name is Joshua Tucker, and I'm a professor of politics at New York University and a co-director of the NYU Center for Social Media and Politics. In my testimony today, I'd like to highlight the following 4 points. First, despite recent controversies around various social media platforms, there appears to have been no appreciable drop in social media usage among U.S. adults. Therefore, social media remain viable platforms for reaching large portions of the U.S. population. Second, there's a great deal of variation in how social media tools can be used to communicate with the public, both due to platform affordances or the setup of the platforms themselves, as well as to the preferences of different members of Congress. Third, there are crucial distinctions between communicating with constituents through the U.S. Postal Service and social media platforms. In particular, members have much less control over how their messages are delivered and to whom, as well as less of an ability to monitor, in retrospect, how well these processes are working. Fourth, ongoing efforts to make social media data available for outside research and analysis should therefore be an important concern for members of Congress, as access to social media data will be necessary to assess the functioning and impact of congressional communication efforts. It is to these third and fourth points that I will address my remaining remarks. I begin with some observations about the consequences of the platform's business models. First, social media platforms generate revenue by selling advertisements, which means messages from members of Congress that are viewed by the public may appear alongside ads over which members have no control. Consider this equivalent to a franking policy that allows companies to insert advertisements into mail sent by Congress. Second, as Chair Kilmer mentioned, posts on social media are not geographically constrained. While this differs by platform, it is practically impossible to ensure that messages posted on social media platforms will only be seen by one's constituents. This has 2 important implications. One is that congressional communications will no longer be written only with one's constituents in mind. This means that all members will have more of an incentive to think about national as opposed to local audiences. The other is that it will be impossible to ensure equality in terms of exposure to messages when the medium is social media. It's always going to be the case that members with larger numbers of followers will enjoy greater reach for their messages than those with fewer followers. Third, most social media platforms deliver content through proprietary algorithms. This is the secret sauce of social media. This means that for platforms that display content in any manner other than a simple chronological approach, no one outside of the company knows how the company determines what viewers will actually see. This in turn means that members of Congress are unable to control how, or even if, their content is seen, and that they will be at the mercy of any algorithmic changes the platforms decide to make in the future. While individual users can receive information about exposures to their posts, the ability of outside observers to assess these patterns at scale is often severely constrained, thus making it difficult for Congress to retrospectively monitor the impact of its members' communication strategies. It is against this backdrop that I turn to the importance of data access for assessing the impact of social media on politics. A disturbingly large portion of the data necessary to investigate the internet's effect on politics and democracy are locked inside social media companies. And these firms are generally reluctant to share that data for outside analysis. One reason for this reluctance is the costs, legal, financial, and reputational, of unauthorized disclosure that are so high. Another reason is an emerging digital privacy movement, which is both necessary and salutary given the real dangers to privacy in the new digital environment, but unfortunately, outside research has become collateral damage in this battle between government regulators, privacy advocates, and the platforms. As we think through this set of issues, it's important to realize that a prohibition on making social media data available for outside analysis does not mean that these data will be not mined for insights. Rather, it means that only employees of the platforms will be mining the data and learning the answer to the most pressing questions as to social media's impact on democracy and other social phenomena. We therefore need to move beyond the normatively pleasing paradigm of should the platforms respect the privacy of their users, with which of course we all agree in the abstract, to one that fully embraces the trade-offs inherent between legitimate privacy concerns on the one hand and the social good that can come from making data accessible to outside researchers on the other hand, whether they are academics trying to study the impact of social media on democracy or congressional offices trying to reach their constituents. It is into this debate that any sort of attempt to monitor the existence and impact of congressional communication through social media will undoubtedly fall. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you for your testimony. And Mr. Billigmeyer, you're now recognized for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Kilmer and members of the committee for the opportunity to speak today. My name is Josh Billigmeyer, and I'm the CEO of Fireside, one of the leading providers of CRM technologies in Congress. Our company provides the software that allows over 150 members to manage all of the incoming letters and emails from constituents and quickly turn around thoughtful, relevant responses. As CEO of this company, I've had a front row seat to understand how congressional offices operate, how they manage their mail, and how they decide when and how to communicate with their constituents. I've had countless conversations with members, chiefs of staff, legislative directors, and correspondents, and have gained a thorough understanding of the practical challenges related to franking. There's no doubt that we've seen an explosion of communication sent to members of Congress over the last 10 to 15 years. Our software has allowed congressional offices to take these messages in, categorize, understand, and more efficiently respond to constituents. But the rules that govern outbound communication with constituents have not fundamentally changed over the last few decades. Based on my experience, I recommend 3 overarching rule changes for franking. Recommendation number 1, streamline the franking approval process. Mr. Chairman, imagine that you've just finished watching the State of the Union address and you want to send an email to your constituents highlighting some of the policies outlined in the speech. Your staff drafts up an email and they send it to the Franking Commission for approval. Your staff may have to wait for days, if not a week, to get approval for franking to send out that mail during these surge times. The franking approval process often takes far too long. Congress should not have an approval process that makes something no longer newsworthy by the time they're able to send it out. My strong recommendation is that Congress find an approval process that takes less than 24 hours for content to be sent out by email. I don't have all the solutions, but I'm confident that with some changes to the approval process and the technology used to facilitate the approval process, Congress can meet this challenge. My second recommendation is allow offices to send multiple follow-up responses to a constituent without franking approval. If 500 people in a congressional district contact their member of Congress urging them to co-sponsor legislation, the office can respond to those 500 people without needing franking approval. However, after those responses are sent, if the member then decides to co-sponsor that piece of legislation, their staff will have to get approval from franking to send an update to those 500 people, letting them know that they co-sponsored the bill. And if that piece of legislation passes the House of Representatives, the office will again have to get approval from the Franking Commission to send out an email letting those 500 people know that the legislation has passed. It's my strong recommendation that regardless of how many people contact a congressional office on a policy issue or a piece of legislation, the office should have the ability to send multiple follow-up emails to the interested constituents without needing franking approval. And finally, my third recommendation is create a task force to study how franking rules should be updated in light of emerging technologies. I predict within the next 3 years, members of Congress will have access to 2 new technology innovations that will dramatically improve their ability to communicate with constituents. My company, Fireside, has been experimenting with artificial intelligence and machine learning to help offices manage the onslaught of inbound communications from constituents. And we are also introducing technology that will be available to members of Congress next year to allow staff to automate the process of writing responses to constituents. This automatic letter writing technology can be programmed to follow all the franking rules. So when a member uses these automatic letter writing tools, we can ensure the content of the letter is kept within the boundaries of the franking guidelines, and therefore we won't need any of these letters to get prior franking approval. The point is this: the franking rules that were created decades ago need to be updated to account for the way Congress operates now. But Congress should also be creating policies that not only apply today, but will work for emerging technologies in the future. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify on my ideas to modernize congressional mailing standards.
Thank you. Thank you for your testimony, each of you. We'll now go into enabling members of the committee to ask questions. I'll start and recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. And I'm not sure if I should direct this to Dr. Glassman or Dr. Tucker. I'm curious what we can learn from how the Senate does this, both with regard to social media. My understanding, I may be wrong about this, but you know, I know on the House side, we have multiple versions of ourselves. We have, you know, official Derek and unofficial Derek. My understanding is they may do things differently in the Senate. I wanted to get your reaction to that. I also know that they have a hard cap on the amount members can spend on franking. Curious if you have a reaction to whether that's a good thing, bad thing.
I can certainly speak to the hard cap. The hard cap in the Senate is on the amount of postal mass mail that members can send. It's $50,000 in postage per year, and it's probably the driving reason that the Senate dramatically decreased its franking postal costs since it was instituted in 1994. Very few senators send mass postal mailings. I think in 2018, 11 senators sent one or more mass mailings. A similar cap might reduce costs in the House quite significantly without affecting too many members. You can imagine a cap of, say, $100,000 on total cost of mass mailing. That would save $8.5 million off of last year, reducing costs by 30%, and 3/4 of members wouldn't even be affected by it.
I can't say that I'm familiar with the Senate's rules on what they do regarding social media accounts, so I can't answer the question directly. What I can state is I've been sending students in to interview members of Congress, both on the House side and the Senate side, for the last 6 years, to ask the people in their office who are responsible for drafting the social media posts and responsible for overseeing the process. And what has continually amazed me is the variation that we see across offices and the ways in which there are so many different approaches taken across different offices. So it would surprise me, I haven't sort of seen a kind of best practices emerging where people are sort of converging around one set of practices around this. And one of the big questions that always comes up is the question of finding the different accounts of the members of Congress, right? So there's the official account, there can be the campaign account, there can also be the personal account. And so this actually also causes difficulties on the back end, where if you're trying to monitor how members of Congress are communicating with constituents, you have to try to track down all these different accounts. It also causes, as was mentioned by Representative Davis the first during the earlier panel, right? This causes a problem if you have a lot of followers who are on one of your social media accounts trying to figure out how to get them to the other social media account. And given the fact that there are different monitoring systems set up for official accounts versus non-official accounts, it seems like a fairly inefficient way, both from the members' perspective and from those of us who are trying to understand how the members are using these communication tools.
Mr. Billigmeyer, I wanted to get a sense from you whether there are things being done, technologies being used, communication strategies being used in the private sector that you think Congress ought to take a crack at.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chairman. I think probably like everyone else, I'm signed up for Axios news alerts. When you go to Axios, you can select the topics that you're interested in and then get emails based on that. I subscribe to political and technology. I don't care quite as much about healthcare or China. And those kind of practices can be utilized by members of Congress as well. Most constituents aren't interested in getting information on all of the topics that you address, and so allowing them to choose maybe Veterans Affairs or other topics that they're interested in, and then tailoring the content to that to keep them more engaged is a good practice.
Do you know, is that allowed right now under our rules?
Yes, in fact, I did a quick audit of all the members' email sign-up forms. Only one member asks for those interests, but yes, you're allowed to ask constituents which items they're interested in. The challenge is that, you know, when you tailor content for constituents, you wind up sending out a lot more content that's different, and that's where the franking process becomes kind of a bottleneck for that.
You spoke in your testimony to things that you thought ought to be changed. Which franking rules do you, in your view, continue to have some value, should be kept, should be updated?
Yeah, I think speaking as a constituent, I would say I like all the common sense ones about, you know, not allowing members to endorse things or have highly political speech. Those seem like common sense things. The blackouts. Again, I don't know what the pros and cons necessarily are of those, but I think those are all valuable things to keep in there.
Terrific. Okay. With that, let me invite Ms. Brooks. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to those on the panel for coming today. When I first came to Congress in 2013, it did baffle me that we could not migrate our campaign. It's the first time I had run for office, first time, it created a campaign account, and those people that were following us, that we had to educate them in very difficult ways, if my memory serves me correct, only at one time could we even inform them, to go to the official account. So I'd like to talk about that a little bit more, Dr. Tucker. What do you think are the pros and cons, quite frankly, of us migrating our campaign followers to the official count and vice versa?
So I really don't see any cons to it. I mean, essentially what you're solving is a friction problem. You've got people who signed up, who want to follow you, who want to get information about you, and now you have another vehicle where you're going to be providing that information. And so this is just a sort of costly problem for the constituents in that they're signed up to get information one way, and now the information is going to be coming through another channel. And so we know that the way people say, you're talking about a Twitter account, right? You could tweet to your followers, right, that you are switching accounts and that they should sign up for this other account. But one of the things that we know about Twitter is that people don't see every single tweet that shows up in their feed. There's a lot of different factors that focus into this, depending on how many people they're following, depending on how often they log online, and it's very, very easy for them to miss this. The way most people interact with Twitter is not by going to people's pages who they're following and seeing what those people have tweeted recently. It's by this newsfeed function, which is exactly what I was talking about with not knowing how the algorithm serves up this information in terms of the way things are ordered on the newsfeed. So to me, it seems like if you had a process in place where people could migrate followers across these different lists, it would be only beneficial to constituents. There's a larger question, right, which is the larger issue of when we talk about people who are following you, if you want to try to have a situation where you have a way to communicate with constituents, right? Social media is never going to be information that's limited to constituents. So you may have other people who choose to follow you who aren't constituents, but of course your constituents, one of the key hallmarks of social media is they can reshare your information and their followers can reshare the information as well. So if you pushed me to a sort of pro for why you might want to keep these accounts separate, the only thing I would say is potentially for the members, you might have a greater national following on your campaign account because you are trying to raise money outside of your district, and then you're trying to develop this kind of separate list of people who are in your district who might actually follow your official account. But in practice, this is a time-consuming effort that imposes costs on the members and imposes costs on the constituents and the followers as well.
Thank you very much. Mr. Billingmeyer, the task force, you recommended setting up a task force so we can continue to explore emerging technologies. Who would you have on the task force? There is quite a variety of expertise, and particularly with respect to members of Congress. How would you decide, what thoughts do you have about the task force?
I'd probably echo a previous testimony from Brad Fitch of the Congressional Management Foundation, who suggested having communications directors and press secretaries, those people who are on the ground and using all of those technologies and have a firm grasp on the tasks and workflows that they're doing. I think that's a great group of people to start with.
Okay, thank you. I'll yield back time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pocan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the panel. Let me just pose a question for all of you around social media advertising, because I don't do the franking in our office, so I'm a little bit of a neophyte on this, but I was just talking to Rodney about it. So it sounds like if you have an ad in social media, we're going to review what you're saying, and if the quantity is over certain quantities when we review it. Yet the real value to social media is who you can target, which is what I do with my business on a daily basis. You can get an ad as specific as your spouse to say happy birthday, right? We know that because you can get that specific. I can pick suburban women who belong to unions and send a message that I could never do that via mail, but that's a lot of value to being able to use that, yet no one's ever gonna look at that. Can you just address that issue, the difference? Because that's where my bigger concern is you can really start to use it in an official capacity that's awful campaign-like.
So it's important to understand that, again, this all varies across platforms, so I'm gonna speak at a general level here. But what's important to understand, and I addressed this in the written testimony, is that when members have access to social media for communications purposes, there are sort of two distinct ways you can do this. One is you can have what's called organic reach, which is you are posting things on social media, and hopefully a lot of people have signed up to follow you and will share that information or will see that information. Then there's targeted advertising, right? Which involves paying for ads. And again, some platforms you can do this, some platforms you can't do this. What you're talking about is this kind of hyper ability that's now generating what people are calling excessive micro-targeting here, where you have companies, especially Google and Facebook, which now can give you these incredible sort of precision in where you're targeting the ads. But these are two very different things, right? And this is one of the advice that I give in the written testimony they had, is that anything that you do in terms of thinking about social media usage by members of Congress, please be clear to sort of specify whether it is intended to apply to advertising, and we have all sorts of regulations around advertising by members of Congress, or whether it's intended to apply to organic reach. And the interesting thing is, right, organic reach, and this is what I said in my remarks about it not being equal, right? Different members of Congress have different numbers of followers for lots of different reasons. There's no way you can ensure that that's equal. Advertising, you can put limits on how much members of Congress can spend on these different types of advertising if that's, you know, in the realm of what you're doing with advertising. But these are, again, so these are very different types of approaches here. And with the organic, you can't necessarily target it the same way you can target ads.
Sure. And I guess I'm trying to get to the specifics of the abuse via that advertising part, because I agree on the post, some people get it, some people don't, but you can be very, very specific and to a point of really what we do in campaigns, and no one's ever going to look at it under the current set of rules. So that's like the concern I'm trying to put out there.
Right, so again, that goes back to the latter part of my testimony about the importance of ensuring data access to outside analysts, right? And so this is the only way that we're going to understand the political impact of social media is if outside analysts, people not working for the platforms themselves who are under NDAs and have pre-publication review with their own companies, have access to this data to try to understand what's in that. And I think there are efforts underway. Facebook has made an ads archive available that they're trying to take steps forwards in this. But in terms of, as you are thinking about reforming and you're thinking about congressional communication in the 21st century, I would, on both of these dimensions, the organic content and the advertising content, I think it's very important that you do what you can to make sure that this data is made available for analysis, both by the government, so you can make correct policy, but also to people like myself, so that we can help you make correct policy by providing factual information and thorough information about what's happening in these regards.
I have one comment as well. This goes back to, kind of obsolete rules within it. The original rules say you're not allowed to collect data on constituents that identify whether they're a Republican or a Democrat based on party affiliation, but it's based on the communications that you get from constituents and maybe surveys that you send. You can very easily, you can make a one-question survey today to your constituents that says something like, do you support impeachment? And you're probably gonna know exactly which political party is in that, or with a few things. So, the original intent of franking was, I believe, and maybe Matt can talk to this, was to not allow offices to overuse that information. But with all of the streams of public information now, it's very easy for you to know that information about constituents.
Yeah, I mean, the main thing I would say is that the current framework I set up, the idea is that anything you're sending on the frank side or through official content is official representational content. And that's how they separate campaign items from official representations. And I wouldn't shortchange how much you can target using the frank. Anyone who has a constituent relations management platform, like every member does, knows you can get someone who is this age, this gender, who's sent 2 letters on gun control, and can pretty easily do a 499 to them or something bigger.
Thank you.
All right, Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Very interesting panel. Thank you all for your comments. What you're discussing with us is what I consider delving into the weeds, which really that's what this committee, this select committee is here to do. My first question, Mr. Billingmeyer, we do share the goal of providing better experiences for members and making member communications with constituents even more effective and easier too. the House isn't the easiest environment to operate in, right? So can you tell us about any roadblocks or difficulties you or other vendors run into that have prevented you from introducing some of the new features that you mentioned in your testimony?
Absolutely. I would say that, one of the unique aspects of Congress, as I'm sure you've heard, is the fact that there's state actors, security, trying to compromise our political process. And so I believe for a long time, the House Information Resources has certainly had very restrictive guidelines around where data can be hosted, specifically constituent data, and up until recently was very restrictive in terms of keeping that inside the House network, which restricts vendors from using things like cloud services a lot of times to do analysis on data. And from what I understand, they've been doing a lot of work on that. Their number one priority has been enabling vendors like myself to access those types of resources. And I'm confident within the next year or two, we'll have the paths that we need to leverage that. Kind of to give you a little example of where that winds up practically, when we did our research on machine learning, we partnered with a machine learning consulting group, and we took all the constituent mail from 4 offices and processed all that using modern machine learning, which is very CPU intensive. They asked us how many servers we had on the House. We told them, and they said it's probably going to take about 10 years to process all of that information. So we had to move all that to Amazon, where there's specialized hardware to do that. And my understanding is that House Information Resources, the group that oversees all that, is making policies to allow us to do that eventually.
How do you think some of the new technologies will be able to kind of move our communications into the 21st century? And we're here to talk about franking rules and regulations. What franking rules and regs do you think could still hold up that new technology from being as effective as it could be?
I believe that it's a great question, and I appreciate, number one, I've met with a lot of the staff to kind of talk a lot about the challenges and hear their perspective on it. And what I've heard is there's just ambiguity on how these rules apply. Here's a couple instances. A lot of people have talked about having, one of the franking rules is you can't send the same message to more than 500 people. Let's say you wanted to deploy a modern chatbot to your website, right? Constituents come a lot of times asking questions. A lot of times they'll send you a paper mail. A more efficient way to process that is just have a little, chatbot like a lot of companies have on your homepage that says, what can I help you with? Well, I'm interested in casework. Great, here's the form to fill that out. But, is that solicited? Is that unsolicited? Is it, if you send more than 500 of those same responses to people who are on the chatbot, does that fall into the franking guidelines? So that's why I kind of recommend a task force to look at kind of a lot of these things that offices have questions about and aren't quite sure where that goes. And another area, if I can elaborate a little bit more, is that, in the private sector, almost all of the communications are not big monolithic emails that you get from vendors. They're small reminders, they're notifications, they're looking at your interests and making small predictions and then saying, you bought these certain products, would you be interested in buying this other product? Or you watch these few movies on Netflix, they make a prediction. Are you interested in seeing these other movies? As a member of Congress, you could do the same thing for constituents. If somebody writes in about a military base in your district, you could also notify them, hey, did you know that I voted on legislation that affects veterans as well? Making a prediction that they've been interested in some topics and they might be interested in other topics. But when, again, the franking model is people draft content, people approve content, and then it gets sent out. And in the private sector, that doesn't really exist. You have computers analyzing, deciding when to send messages, drafting the messages, and sending the messages. And those two are incompatible, and that's why there needs to be a big reevaluation of the process.
I appreciate the panel. I appreciate your responses, and it's interesting you mentioned kind of upselling new ideas and communications. I remember when I first started my first job, my upsell was, do you want fries with that? So clearly it works. I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Delbene.
Thank you. Thanks to all of you for being here with us today. I want to follow up a little bit on the same theme, Mr. Billingmeyer. Talk a little bit, when we talk about other technologies, and you talked about kind of some of the kind of automated response, or at least, help to create responses. Talk a little bit about kind of concerns you might have with the personalization of those responses, and do we get to a place where it's automatic responses versus really having a true conversation with our constituents? The personal side of it. I worry about how that could be lost.
That's an excellent question. I would say what technology can help you with is filter out. So as a member of Congress, kind of at your level, my understanding of members and what they're looking for is when they look at all the information they're getting from their constituents, they would like to do two things. Number one, they kind of want to know a global picture of how does all of their constituency feel? What percentage of them support a particular bill? What percentage of them don't support it? And then after that, they're also looking for personal stories for how people are affected. When you all when members of Congress make speeches before Congress, they usually don't show a graph or something. They say, Sally in my district was affected by this policy in this way. And so what we try and do is make sure, we're using machine learning in a lot of ways to try and process kind of that overall view and give you a good view of what constituents feel in your district, but also giving your staff the ability to identify those important stories. And as you know, probably a lot, half of the communications that come to Congress are all templated, and they're, a constituent clicks on, yes, I submit this, I support this measure somewhere, and you get kind of a templated message. Those, you don't need your staff to eyeball those. That's where a machine can look at that, say, yes, we'll put that into the overall sentiment tally. But when somebody writes in saying, I'm having trouble with getting casework, I'm a vet, I'm not getting the support that I need, and it needs to be handed off to caseworkers, that's where you don't want that to get lost in the mix, and you want to be able to make those personal connections for your constituents.
So you're talking about kind of taking incoming information and being able to parse it out so it's getting the right response or to the right person more quickly.
Yes, if I may, I'll give you a quick example. I recently visited one office, and I was looking at their practices. I noticed that they had turned off every single automation and every single efficiency measure within the system. And I said, I'm very curious about why you did this. And they said, well, we had on everybody's contact form, you usually have a option that says, yes, I would like a response from you, or no, I just want you to know my opinion. And it's a common practice. If a constituent isn't expecting a response, then you kind of skim that and close it out because they're not really expecting a response. A veteran wrote in with suicidal notes, but clicked the I don't need a response, and that kind of got lost in the process. So I think that's a unique aspect of Congress, is that every message has a lot of weight, and you need a process that can find all of those things. But the tension is that your staff can't continue to eyeball every single message. And so that's why we're looking at machine learning to try and find those very relevant messages in this sea of noise. And you see that a lot on social media where, if you go and post something, you're going to get a lot of very interesting responses and comments on that, not a lot of them helpful, and then one of them that may reference, again, somebody seeking casework or somebody having some trouble in the district that you still want to get without having to look at every, it's impossible to look at every single comment, every single retweet, but that's a good case for computers.
Thanks. Dr. Tucker, I think you had some response too.
Yeah, I just wanted to inject one word of caution in this, which is that we know that the users of any medium of communicating are going to be a biased sample of your constituents, right? So the people who have time to write hand letters to you, the people who have the means to get on the internet and send emails versus the people who sign up for social media platforms. And so I just think it's very important for the members to keep that in mind, that as they go, if many, many years, the only way you got communication was from letters, you have a good sense of which of your constituents are the kinds who are going to write letters, and which are the ones that, and that will allow you to sort of interpret that through the lens of how representative is this sentiment that we're getting off of handwritten letters or typewritten letters that are sent into the office. Now you're going to have members receiving communications from tons of different means, right? You're going to have mail, you're going to have phones, you're going to have emails, you're going to have automated emails, and then you're going to have, you know, we saw that the average, in one of the CRS reports recently, they said the average member of Congress had 6 different social media accounts, right? So that's 6 different types of platforms, and I have some data about this in the report, but different people use these platforms at different rates. And so this is like, all of a sudden now, there's lots of different biases. Oh, okay, we're hearing about this from comments on YouTube. Like, is that representative of my constituents? And I think that there is a danger that with these types of tools that will automate across lots of different platforms, you'll get a sort of sense of false precision that, oh, it says 72% of the communications are in favor of this particular issue, but you don't know what that 72% is representing. So I just think it's a word of caution to think about that as we go.
Now, also, in a district like mine where there's a lot of rural areas and not necessarily good broadband access,
Exactly.
those aren't folks who can participate online as much, and their voices will be lost. They're more likely to send letters or may not be able to participate day to day on the social media side. So, thank you very much, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I just had actually one other thing I wanted to raise before we call it a day. I think one of the challenges members face is, based on how we currently do things, you find yourself having to choose between doing more proactive communications with your constituents or paying your staff, right? I mean, I think about in my first term as a freshman member, you know, when everyone was a new hire, I had more capacity in my budget so that I was able to do that sort of proactive outreach and keep, even in the most remote rural parts of my district, to Congresswoman Del Bene's point, keep folks up to date on what we were working on. As I've tried to retain these terrifically talented people, you know, that slice of our office budget has, you know, shrunk stupendously. Any thoughts on, as this committee deals with these issues, potential solutions to that? Should we look at taking that franking out of the MRA, the members' resource, the office budget, or do you have other ideas? Go ahead.
So I have mixed feelings about a change like moving franking out of the MRA. I'm a big believer that we need to increase the resource available to members, particularly for staff, to pay them better and have more of them. I think it's vitally important for the legislative branch as a whole. Traditionally, franking costs weren't in the MRA. In the old days, the post office just ate the cost, and we never even accounted for it. And then starting in the 50s, Congress started reimbursing them just with a general pool of funds in the ledge branch appropriation bill. And you know, the reason it was changed to put in the MRA was to try to reduce costs. Personally attaching these costs to members, making them choose, put a market value on franking. All of a sudden, if you had to choose between staff and franking, you might frank a lot less. If it was just in a common pool you could draw with no repercussions, people are going to spend a lot. So consequently, moving the franking itself out of the MRA would probably, if you just did that period, would lead to an explosion in franked mail. And so I would probably suggest doing that in coupling it with a cap of some sort. But even that would encourage members who currently spend nothing on franking because they want to have a lot of staff to start franking if they didn't have to have a cost to it. That said, there's other costs to franking. One of the things about the MRA, and we give it to members, is because we like the idea, we believe in the idea that members should be able to represent their constituents as they see fit and arrange their offices as they see fit. And that's great to have a decentralized system. On the other hand, there's certain things that every member spends money on. Everybody has an office in the Rayburn building or the Cannon building. We don't charge you rent to be here, and then you just give it back. And so things that are, you know, costs that are just common across all offices, such as the cost of CRM software, which runs tens of thousands of dollars a year for members, could easily be off-boarded to a central fund. You wouldn't see people increasing costs particularly much. And we could just think of that as something that comes with the office that we don't have to have in the MRA, freeing up money for, you know, almost another half a staffer at that point.
I would just note that when you think about social media as a form of communications, those two conflicting goals, actually staff or communications, overlap, right? Because the cost of using social media to communicate with constituents is having the staff member who knows what they're doing and who can oversee this, who can deal with the multiple platforms, can craft strategy and those sorts of things. So clearly that's one of, I've given you a lot of caveats about using social media as a communication strategy, but those are all caveats in terms of understanding the consequences of what's going to happen with it. It also offers tremendous promise, right, for exactly this reason that you're talking about, because this organic content that you can put out there on social media, these are things that have, very low budget implications. And in the sense of dealing with staff or not, what you're really looking for there is spending on staff who can help people manage that.
Yeah, one example, when I started working, interacting with offices a lot, say about 10 years ago, the mail process was pretty specific. You had LCs who sorted the mail and LAs who drafted all the letters and stuff. And now it gradually migrated over time to LCs now drafting mail. And there's offices now who now have interns drafting replies to constituents, which would have been unthinkable 10 years ago. So I think that I agree with Matt that the problem is the resources being available to this to member offices. And for us as a vendor, we've raised prices, I don't know, $35 a month over the last 10 years of our CRM, even though the cost of hiring and retaining programmers has just kind of gone through the roof. So those are just challenges. I think we have a lot of these little pains here and there because there's just limited resources for member offices.
Terrific. With that, I'd like to thank all of our witnesses for their testimony today. You took what could be a dry subject and made it actually pretty interesting. I also want to thank the Select Committee staff for their hard work in putting together these hearings, and the Budget Committee for allowing us to use their room. And thank you for transcribing all that we're doing. And thank you to C-SPAN for covering us. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. And I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you are able. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. And with that, this hearing is adjourned. Thanks, everybody. Happy Halloween.